The man who lives alone faces a unique challenge, one that can either refine him or destroy him. It is the challenge of solitude. Now, some people think solitude is just about being physically alone, but it's much more than that. It's about what happens in the absence of external structure, when no one is watching, when there is no one to hold you accountable except yourself. And here's the fundamental truth. Solitude is not neutral. It is a test. Either you master it or it masters you. A man alone has to learn to become his own authority. That means he has to set his own rules, define his own standards, and enforce his own discipline. There's no external pressure forcing him to wake up at a certain time. No one checking whether he keeps his space clean. No immediate consequences if he chooses to waste an entire day in idleness. And this is precisely what makes solitude dangerous. Because without discipline, a man who lives alone can very easily slip into a slow, steady decline without even realizing it. It often starts with small things. Maybe he stays up late one night watching something meaningless, convincing himself that it's just one night. Then the next morning he wakes up later than he intended, but it doesn't really matter because no one is waiting for him. He skips his morning routine because, well, who's going to notice? And before he knows it, this becomes a pattern. His days become inconsistent. His routines start to break down. He stops pushing himself, and soon he stops expecting much from himself at all. This is how chaos takes over a man's life. Not all at once, but in increments, in small moments of neglect that compound over time. And once chaos sets in, it's incredibly difficult to reverse. Because when a man's standards drop, they don't just drop to a new level and stay there. No, they continue falling. And without external pressure, without someone else demanding better from him, he has no reason to stop that decline. He becomes comfortable in his own mediocrity, and before long, he's living a life far below his potential. But it doesn't have to be this way. Solitude, if used correctly, can be a tremendous force for growth. It can be a period of intense self-improvement, a time when a man forges himself into someone stronger, more capable, and more independent. But this only happens if he imposes discipline upon himself, if he structures his days with purpose, if he sets high standards for himself and follows through on them. A disciplined man who lives alone wakes up at the same time every day, not because someone is making him, but because he understands that structure is necessary. He keeps his home in order, not because anyone else will see it, but because he refuses to live in a space that reflects laziness and neglect. He exercises, he reads, he works on his goals, not for anyone else, but because he refuses to let himself become weak. The disciplined man knows that the mind follows the body. If he lets his physical environment decay, his mental state will follow. If he allows his body to become weak, his willpower will erode alongside it. So he treats his solitude as a training ground. He sees it as an opportunity to build himself up rather than an excuse to let himself fall apart. And here's the remarkable thing. When a man truly masters solitude, he becomes unstoppable. Because most people, whether they realize it or not, depend on external pressure to keep them moving forward. They rely on other people to push them, to keep them accountable, to remind them of their responsibility. But the man who has mastered solitude, he doesn't need that. He has built an internal system of discipline that functions no matter where he is, no matter who is or isn't watching. This is why men who have mastered solitude are often the most formidable individuals in any field. They don't require constant validation. They don't need someone to motivate them. They have already done the hard work of disciplining themselves, of learning how to function at a high level without external reinforcement. And because of this, when they do step back into society, they do so as strong, capable individuals. not as men who are desperately seeking direction, but as men who have already found it. But here's the catch. This level of self-mastery is not easy to achieve. It requires an active commitment. It requires a man to be honest with himself about his weaknesses, about his bad habits, about the ways in which he might be deceiving himself. It requires constant vigilance, because the moment he lets up, the moment he allows comfort to overtake discipline, he begins the slow slide toward chaos once again. The truth is that solitude is a double-edged sword. It can sharpen a man, or it can dull him. It can make him stronger, or it can make him weaker. And the determining factor is whether he has the discipline to impose order upon himself. So if you are a man living alone, you must ask yourself, are you using this time to build yourself into someone stronger? Or are you allowing yourself to slip into a slow decline? Are you structuring your days with purpose? Or are you drifting aimlessly, waiting for life to give you a reason to act? Because make no mistake, if you do not take control of your solitude, it will take control of you. And by the time you realize it, it may already be too late. When a man lives alone, he may believe that he is simply enjoying his independence, free from the constraints and responsibilities that come with living with others. At first, this can feel liberating. No one to answer to, no conflicts over schedules or habits, no external expectations dictating how he should live his life. But there is a hidden danger in this state, one that creeps in slowly, often unnoticed. What begins as solitude can easily slip into something far more destructive: isolation. And once a man falls into isolation, it becomes a trap that is difficult to escape. Human beings are inherently social creatures. We have evolved to function within groups, to rely on shared responsibilities, to learn and grow through interaction with others. Even those who are naturally introverted or prefer a quiet lifestyle still require some level of connection to maintain a healthy mind and a balanced life. The danger of living alone is that it removes the natural accountability that comes with social interaction. Without regular engagement with others, a man can gradually lose touch with the very things that keep him grounded: his sense of purpose, his social instincts, and his ability to communicate effectively with the world around him. At first, the transition into isolation is subtle. A man living alone may initially enjoy the peace and quiet. He tells himself that he is simply focused on his work or personal projects, that he doesn't need the constant distractions of socializing. But slowly, his habits begin to change. He starts to withdraw, making fewer plans with friends, avoiding phone calls, and skipping events he once enjoyed. As time passes, he finds that reaching out to others requires more effort than it once did. Conversations start to feel forced. Social gatherings become draining, and eventually he convinces himself that he is better off alone. This is where the real danger begins. Isolation is not just about physical separation from others. It is a mental and emotional state that feeds on itself. The longer a man isolates himself, the harder it becomes to reintegrate into social life. His confidence erodes. He begins to second-guess his ability to connect with people. He loses the small, everyday interactions that reinforce his place in the world. And because there is no one around to challenge his thoughts, his mind becomes an echo chamber, reinforcing his worst tendencies and fears. One of the most damaging effects of isolation is the erosion of self-awareness. When a man is alone for too long, he loses the ability to see himself clearly. In a social environment, we receive constant feedback from others, whether it's through a friend pointing out when we're being unreasonable, a colleague challenging our ideas, or a loved one reminding us of our strengths. These interactions shape our identity and keep us accountable. But when a man is isolated, he has no external reference points. He may develop habits or beliefs that go unchecked, leading to distorted thinking patterns. He may become overly critical of himself, spiraling into self-doubt, or he may become overly self-indulgent, convincing himself that he is fine just as he is, even if he is slowly deteriorating. Another consequence of isolation is the weakening of emotional resilience. Social interaction forces us to navigate challenges, disagreements, and compromises, all of which build emotional strength. A man who isolates himself avoids these challenges, and as a result, he becomes less capable of handling stress, conflict, and adversity. When problems do arise, he finds himself unequipped to deal with them because he has spent so much time retreating from the very experiences that would have strengthened him. Furthermore, isolation often leads to a loss of motivation. Human beings are driven by purpose, and much of our sense of purpose comes from our interactions with others. Whether it's providing for a family, contributing to a team, or simply being part of a social network, these connections give us reasons to push forward. A man who isolates himself loses this sense of purpose. He may find himself struggling to stay motivated, procrastinating on important tasks, or falling into a cycle of lethargy and avoidance. Without external encouragement or pressure, he loses the drive to improve himself, to take on new challenges, or to strive for something greater. Perhaps one of the most overlooked aspects of isolation is its impact on physical health. When a man is socially engaged, he has reasons to take care of himself. He wants to look presentable. He wants to be physically capable. He wants to participate in activities with others. But when he is isolated, these incentives disappear. He may neglect his diet, stop exercising, or fall into unhealthy habits simply because there is no immediate consequence. There is no one to notice his decline, no one to call him out when he starts to let himself go. Over time, this neglect takes a serious toll, leading to deteriorating health, both physically and mentally. The final and most devastating risk of isolation is the loss of meaning. Humans derive meaning from relationships, from being part of something larger than themselves. When a man isolates himself, he loses the sense of belonging that gives life its richness and depth. He may begin to feel disconnected from the world, questioning his own relevance, struggling with existential doubts. And because he has cut himself off from others, he has no one to turn to for reassurance, no one to remind him that he matters. This can lead to deep loneliness, depression, and in extreme cases, even despair. So, what can a man do to prevent isolation from consuming him? He must recognize it for the danger that it is. He must be proactive in maintaining connections, even when it feels easier to withdraw. He must set rules for himself. Regular social engagements, phone calls to friends, participation in community or group activities. Even small interactions like chatting with a neighbor or engaging in a shared hobby can make a significant difference. Most importantly, he must be honest with himself. He must ask, am I choosing solitude or am I slipping into isolation? Because one leads to strength and self-mastery, while the other leads to stagnation and decay. In the end, isolation is not something that happens all at once. It is a slow erosion of connection, a gradual detachment from the world. And if a man is not careful, he may not realize he is isolated until he is already lost in it. The key is to remain vigilant, to actively seek out relationships, and to never let the silence of solitude turn into the emptiness of isolation.